Today, we are going to go over setting up a virtual environment for your machine. A virtual environment is a Python environment that is isolated from other Python environments. Okay, but what does that really mean? One of the main reasons to use a virtual environment is to set up dependencies for the specific project that other projects may not need. For example, this upcoming FastAPI project is going to need FastAPI and other tools as dependencies for this project. If you have other Python projects on your machine that doesn't need these dependencies, why not isolate this specific project that does? It's always a good rule of thumb to isolate and silo projects when possible so other projects don't get corrupted with unneeded dependencies. Now, a virtual environment is completely optional, and you do not need a virtual environment on your machine to properly run FastAPI. So if you do not want a virtual machine, feel free just to download the pip right onto the machine itself and completely ignore the virtual environments. So how are we going to install these dependencies? Well, first we're going to use pip. Pip is the Python package manager. Pip is used to install and update packages and dependencies for your project. With that, we will make sure you have the latest version of pip installed. To check your pip version on your Mac OS, use Python-3-m pip-version to see what pip version you have currently installed, and on a Windows OS, use Python-m pip-version. The version you get back may or may not be the same as mine, but as long as you have Python 3 installed, everything should work perfectly. So this brings us to the question of how will we be setting up the virtual environment? Well, first, I already created a brand new folder and directory called FastAPI. Within my FastAPI folder is where I will be starting the next lecture in creating the FastAPI application. Make sure you already have a folder created on your personal computer. Then, within our pip, we will be checking what dependencies we already have installed on our machine. If we do not have virtual env, which is the dependency for creating a virtual environment, then we will install it. Once we get the virtual env, we will create a new environment for our FastAPI specific application. We will activate our FastAPI env, and lastly, we will install FastAPI. Now this may seem like a lot, but we will go through all of this step by step. Well, let's jump into the next lecture and create ourselves a virtual environment. In today's lecture, we will be creating a virtual environment for our FastAPI application on a Windows machine. So the first thing you need to do is to click the Windows button along with CMD. This will open up your command prompt on a Windows machine. Once you open up your command prompt, you should see something similar to my screen. Let's now jump into our desktop where we will be creating the directory and project folder for this course. Once we are on our desktop, let's now create a new folder called FastAPI. We can make this new directory and folder by typing in mkdir FastAPI. And now I'm going to cd into our FastAPI folder that we just created. And now once we are inside this folder, I'm going to create our virtual environment. The first thing we need to do is to use piplist. Piplist will show us everything downloaded onto our machine with Python. So let's go ahead and see what we currently have installed. So the first thing we can notice is I have a bunch of things installed, but close to the bottom, I have virtual environment 20.2.2 version installed on my machine. If you do not have virtual env already installed on a machine, you can install it by typing in pip
install virtual env. This will install virtual env onto your personal machine. Now the first thing you can notice is I have a whole bunch of requirements already satisfied, and that's because I already have virtual env installed on my machine. But on your side, if you do not have virtual env installed, you'll probably see a bunch of download links, which is what you're supposed to see as it's installing virtual env. And now from here, we're going to create our FastAPI virtual environment. And again, a virtual environment is a place where we can now run the application and keep the dependencies needed for a FastAPI completely separate from any other Python project you may have on your machine. So the way we can create an environment or a virtual environment is to say python-m venv FastAPI environment, like so. And with that, we now have our own FastAPI environment within our FastAPI project directory. However, our FastAPI environment is currently not running or is not activated. We can do that by cding or getting into our FastAPI environment directory, jumping into the scripts directory, and then activating the environment from there. Once you type in activate, you can see that the FastAPI environment is now activated because it is in the front of the terminal with parentheses saying that name. This means you are currently running inside that virtual environment. You can deactivate an environment by typing in deactivate. And once you type in deactivate, you can see that the parentheses in the environment or the virtual environment now is no longer in front of the terminal line. But for the rest of this course, we want to make sure that that FastAPI environment is activated. We now want to go back into our FastAPI directory. That is going to be the main directory for the entire project. Once inside here, we now want to install all of the dependencies for FastAPI. There are two main dependencies to install FastAPI. The first one is FastAPI, and we also need Uvicorn. Now, FastAPI has a single command to be able to install both of these dependencies. The way to do that is to type in pip install FastAPI, and then within brackets say all. When you type in all, that's going to install all dependencies for FastAPI. Once you click enter, you can see that it's downloading a bunch of things. This is all of the dependencies for FastAPI. You're installing all of the packages, you're setting up all of the install files, and everything is getting installed that you're going to need for FastAPI. Once the installation is complete, on my screen it's telling me that, hey, your pip version is out of date. There's a little newer version out, but if you get the same thing, it's usually not that big of an issue. So now I'm going to close out of my terminal. I'm going to say open on PyCharm. And once I click open, we can see that there's the desktop, and then inside desktop, I have FastAPI. Inside FastAPI, we have FastAPI environment with the scripts that we were using for activating and deactivating. But we want to open up the parent directory of FastAPI, the main project directory. Now from here, we can see that we have our directory open with our FastAPI environment, which is a library root with include, lib, scripts, our venv.cfg. These are just requirements for the virtual environment and can be ignored for right now. But let's go ahead and create our first FastAPI application. If we right-click on the parent directory and say new Python file, From here, we can create our first application. And I'm going to be calling it books because in our future lecture, we're going to be using books as our first API and first project that we create. So we're going to create our first API in this books.py file, but then we're just going to remove it and then add it to our new project. So now you can see that we have the books.py. And once I have this file open, let's check our terminal to make sure we have FastAPI environment running, which we do currently already have the FastAPI environment running because it got carried over from our command prompt. However, if we cd into scripts, we can deactivate it or activate it based on our needs. I'm going to deactivate it just to show that we're able to deactivate it, and now I'm going to reactivate the environment. And now I'm going to type in CLS just to clear the terminal. So the first thing we need to do is to import FastAPI into our books.py file. We can do this by saying from FastAPI import FastAPI. And now we need to say app equals FastAPI. And now under this app variable, we're going to create our first function, which is going to be an API route. And this first API is going to be a RESTful API. This is a real RESTful API running on FastAPI, and this is just showing you the power of how quick FastAPI can work on your machine. The first thing we're going to need to do is make sure we call and create an asynchronous function. We can do that by typing in async, and I'm going to call our first function firstAPI. And I'm going to return a dictionary where the key is message and the value is hello Eric. You can make it whatever you want, but I'm going to say message is hello Eric as a dictionary. Now we're going to need above the function a decorator, and this decorator is going to be app.get, where the path of the API URL is going to be. The first API we're going to create is a get to make this super simple, just so we can see the API running in action. And there we go. That is really all we need. So now let's jump back into our terminal, make sure the FastAPI environment is running, and also make sure we are in our FastAPI parent directory. So I'm going to cd back to our FastAPI directory. And from here, I'm going to type in Uvicorn space books :app -- reload. And immediately we can see that Uvicorn is running on this path. And we'll want to open up this path. And we also can see that we says started reloader process, started server process, waiting for application startup, and now application startup complete. Now this books :app, we just need to make sure that this books is the file of the books that we created, and then :app, which is going to be this app, which is equal to FastAPI. Let's now open up this path. And when we open this path up, we can now see the message of Eric Roby as the response. This is our first RESTful API using FastAPI, where we are now receiving a dictionary of a message with hello Eric as the value. Super, super cool. So in the next video, we're going to expand on books.py and really dive into the power of FastAPI. And I'm excited to jump into this journey with you, and I will see you in the next video. In today's lecture, we will be creating a virtual environment for our FastAPI application on a Mac OS machine. So the first thing you need to do is open up your terminal. Once you have your terminal open, you should see something similar to my screen. Now the first thing you may see in my terminal is that I have zish running. So you can see right here that it says -zsh. Zish is default on a terminal, and we need to change zish to bash. We can do that by typing chsh-s/bin/bash. After that, we're going to have to type in our password for our machine. And now that it was changed, but the only way for us to see bash actually show up on the terminal is to close our terminal and to reopen the terminal. So I'm going to close the terminal and reopen it. And now we can see that we have bash running instead of zish. It's even telling us the same instructions on how to switch back to zish from bash. Let's now jump into our desktop, where we will be making the directory and project folder for this course. Once we are on the desktop, let's now create a new folder called FastAPI. We can make a new directory by typing mkdir FastAPI. And now I'm going to cd into our FastAPI folder we just created. And once we are inside this folder, I'm going to start to create our virtual environment. The first thing we need to do is use pip3 list. Pip3 list will show us everything downloaded onto our machine with Python. So let's go ahead and see what we currently have installed. After typing in pip3 list, we can now see the virtual env installed on my machine at 20.7.2 version. If you do not have virtual env already installed on your machine, you can install it by typing pip3 install virtual env. This will install virtual env onto your personal machine. We can see that I have a whole bunch of requirements already satisfied, and that's because I already have virtual env installed on my machine. If you don't have virtual env installed on your machine, you're going to see a whole bunch of downloads and dependencies getting installed onto your machine so that you can successfully use virtual env. Now from here, we're going to want to now create our virtual environment. We can do that by typing in Python-3 -mvenv FastAPI environment. After typing this in, we will successfully have created a virtual environment for our FastAPI directory and class. Now to activate our environment, we can say .FastAPI environment /bin/activate. We can see that it was a successful activation of our virtual environment because FastAPI env is now in parentheses in front of our entire terminal line. We can deactivate the virtual environment by getting into our bin folder and then saying $source deactivate. We can see that we successfully deactivated the virtual environment as the FastAPI environment in parentheses is no longer in the front of the terminal line. So let's go back to our FastAPI directory that we created on our desktop, which is going to be the main directory for the entire course. And from here, I'm going to do the same .FastAPI environment bin activate to start up the activation of a virtual environment. You can click up on the directional pad on your keyboard to see terminal commands that you have already used. I'm going to click enter and then reactivate the virtual environment. Now that we're in our virtual environment and we are in our parent directory, which is FastAPI, we now need to install FastAPI. Now there's two different ways of installing the dependencies for FastAPI. You can do the easy way, which we will be doing, which is pip3 install FastAPI, and then within square brackets we say all, but that really installs two main dependencies that we can also install separately if needed. The first being FastAPI. FastAPI is the main dependency for being able to use FastAPI. The other dependency is Uvicorn, which we will be installing, but it's already included when we do the all brackets at the end of the pip3 install FastAPI. From what we can see that I'm getting a whole bunch of installations and dependencies getting installed in our virtual environment. These are all dependencies that we need for our FastAPI. And again, we created this virtual environment to keep all of these FastAPI dependencies completely separate from any other Python project we may be creating on our machine. So when we are in this virtual environment, we have FastAPI, but if we get out or deactivate this virtual environment, FastAPI is no longer accessible unless you reinstall it. At the end, we can see that my pip version is outdated by a little bit. That's totally fine as of right now. So now I'm going to close the terminal, and I'm going to open up our FastAPI directory that we created on our desktop. Inside FastAPI, we can see that we see our FastAPI environment, but I'm not going to be opening up that. I'm going to be opening up the parent directory of FastAPI. From here, we can see that we have the FastAPI environment with the bin, include, lib, and pyvenv.cfg, but that's kind of irrelevant right now, as those are just folders for the virtual environment. So I'm going to close that up. We can open up our terminal, and we can see that FastAPI environment is still activated because it's getting carried over from our terminal. If we wanted to deactivate FastAPI env, we can jump into our bin folder and do the deactivate command. So now you can see that I deactivated the FastAPI environment. But for this course, we want this activated. So I'm going to reactivate it. And I just wanted to show that you can deactivate it and activate it from the PyCharm terminal. Now from here, we can right click on this parent directory and say new Python file. And I'm going to name this file books. So books is going to be the first application that we really learn about what FastAPI does. So I'm going to make it books.py so we can create our first starting API. But then after that in the future lectures, we'll delete this first starting API and start really diving into FastAPI. And I will close the terminal. And now within books.py, we now need to import FastAPI into the books.py file. So from FastAPI, import FastAPI. And then after this import, we're going to create a new variable called app, which is equal to FastAPI. And now under this app, we're going to create a new function. And now I'm going to call this function FirstAPI, but we need to make sure this function is also an asynchronous call. So we can do that by typing in async def FirstAPI. And from here, I'm going to return a dictionary. I'm going to have the key equal to message and the value to say, hello, Eric. And now we need to make this method an API. So we can do that quick and easily and efficiently with FastAPI by using the @app decorator and making the app.get equal to an empty string. Now we need to jump into our terminal and start this file up. We can do this by typing in Uvicorn books::app reload. Once you type in this command, we can see we'll watch for changes in these directories. Uvicorn running on http://127.0.0.1:8000. Started reloader process, starting server process, waiting for application startup, and then finally application startup complete. So let's now open up this URL, and we can see that we get message hello Eric returned. So we get the dictionary RESTful API returned to our URL of 127.0.0.1:8000 with our dictionary of message hello Eric. Now this is super exciting. So we successfully created a RESTful API using FastAPI and already rendered it onto a page. Now in the next few videos, we'll remove this first API call and we'll start creating an application. But congratulations on creating your first FastAPI RESTful application programming interface. And I will see you in the next video.